Greetings, everybody. This is Christopher Messina coming at you from the Messy Time Studios in the rainy but still free state of Florida. It is the 26th of May, 2023, and I am delighted to once again have a guest in the studios, my friend and colleague Ken Dekleva, who is a senior fellow with the George H.W. Bush Center for U.S. Chinese Relations and a former senior U.S. government physician diplomat with extensive international experience. Ken, thank you so much for taking the time again today.
Thank you very much, Christopher. It's great to be back on your show.
Excellent. Let's just dive right in. We were kicking some ideas around earlier. Your specialty and a lot of the folks in your line of work was around kind of psychological profiling of leaders for negotiation purposes. Given all that and given what's going on currently, what are the things that are kind of burning a hole in your mind these days about what the U.S. is doing and what we might be doing better?
You asked what are the top of the line issues that I think about in terms of current leadership analysis, leadership psychology, some of the biggest challenges. There are a couple that come to mind. There's the obvious ones, which is how do we manage China and how do we understand China's, in my opinion, highly successful paramount leader, Xi Jinping, not only where he's been and where he's come from, but where he's going and where he's taking China over the next 5 to 10 years and possibly longer, since he's turning 70 this year, and he may well be in a leadership role in China into his early 80s or longer, depending on his health.
Sure.
The other obvious thing
is pretty spry.
Yes, all the reports I've seen are that he's in good health. We know he's not a smoker. From what I've seen, he's not a drinker. He doesn't have bad health habits that could sort of cause him to sidestep. And he when I've seen videos of him or when he gives speeches at major occasions, he can hold his own. So he appears to be pretty fit for his age. The other obvious question mark is the issue of negotiation and leadership in the Ukraine and how this tragic war in Ukraine ends. And I think there's been a lot of exciting changes since we last talked that have to do with feelers that are being put out behind the scenes very quietly, what people will call track 2 or 1.5 diplomacy, not the diplomacy with the bells and whistles and media and cameras, but quiet behind the scenes and involving a lot of different players. And I think we can talk about that in terms of leadership, because President Zelensky, I think, has shown impressive skill beyond his obvious courage and his heroism, but he's shown real political skills in trying to navigate that in his phone call with President Xi last month and in his more recent meeting with the Pope. So there are a lot of people, powerful people, sort of angling who could play a valuable mediation role in helping this tragic war end, especially if, as many experts predict in the national security community, the Ukrainian offensive, which has yet to start, may gain some territory and some victories, but neither their offensive nor the Russian counteroffensive is expected to really change the course of the war in the next few months, even with the weapons the Ukrainians have acquired. So it'll probably be a long type of drawn-out stalemate, and that may drive people to the negotiating table.
It may well. I found something very fascinating. I heard a couple of weeks back that the Russians have lost more troops in this period of conflict by invading Ukraine than they did during their entire misbegotten Afghanistan adventure. I find that kind of astonishing. They were in Afghanistan for a number of years, facing constant hostile pressure, but they've lost more soldiers in this, 14 months? I mean, the Ukrainians have put up a hell of a fight.
Yes, and that's really a remarkable fact. They have probably in Bakhmut, where they have retreated just in the last week or so, lost anywhere on the order of a minimum of 20 to 30,000 people. And these are the numbers they acknowledge, and the true numbers may be higher. What is less known, but also important, is that the Ukrainian military has lost tens of thousands of its top soldiers and officers in the first year of battle, and has had to bring on a brand new, untested officer corps. So again, these are variables that your military experts can talk about. But what I'm more interested in is how they may bring people to the negotiating table and what sort of framework they may look at. The other thing that's interesting is what's going on domestically inside Russia, where there's really been remarkable vocal and at times histrionic criticism of President Putin by Yevgeny Prigozhin on Telegram social media, where he's criticized not only Defense Minister Shoigu and Chief of the General Staff, General Gerasimov, the father of hybrid war, if you will, but also has criticized Putin, using terms like grandpa and things like that, when everyone knows who he's talking about. So Prigozhin is probably a liability, and there are a lot of people who aren't sure how much longer he can stay in his role as CEO of Wagner. And I would not be surprised if Prigozhin somehow gets to a point where he's no longer in that role. I think the Russians will figure that out, and they may redouble by appointing someone in that role who is quiet, adversarial, but far more intelligent and far more dangerous. And the person who, if they did this, who comes to mind would be Victor Bout, who is the arms dealer who was released last year in the trade with Brittany Griner, who has connections all over the world.
An asymmetric transaction. A very asymmetric transaction.
And Bout is a former GRU officer. His father-in-law was a former KGB general. He's very connected with the power centers. He's now in politics, and he has this kind of resolute calm about him, which I saw when I watched his interview on Russian TV after he got out of prison last December. And it begs the question of whether there are people like that who are not as dramatic as Prigozhin, but have dangerous skill sets that we should be aware of. If you think of the recent arms transfer from South Africa to Russia of military kit, it begs the question of whether someone like Victor Bout was involved, because he was based in South Africa for several years in the 90s.
I'd put a big chunk of money on betting black on that one.
So I worry about people with that kind of, if Putin can tap into people with those kind of skill sets diplomatically, on the intelligence front and the military front, then that in a way makes the challenges that Ukraine faces, that President Zelensky faces, that NATO faces, and the West that we face even more difficult.
Related to that, I'm curious, how do you, or do you view the Wagner Group seems to have taken in the last 8 or 10 months quite a hit to its reputation. Right? They used to be, they were feared and very effective, but they have not been exceedingly effective thus far. And you think how, if that's true, if that perception is true, which it may not be, would that kind of play into this whole issue of how the Russian government feels it has to posture itself to the world? If you're losing lots of troops, you don't feel that the man in charge of prosecuting your war efforts is doing it well, and the supposedly feared Praetorian Guard is not that. How badly does that impact the decisions they have to make, and what do they do in response to that?
I think that's a good question. I think the biggest challenge in terms of the Wagner Group is they were effective in part because people at our end understood them, but many underestimated them and their ferocious abilities, especially in the world of cyber hacking, the internet research agency that Prigozhin ran. But part of their effectiveness came from being more secretive. Once they were out in the open with the spotlight shining on them and taking losses, as you've pointed out, on the Eastern Front in the Donbass, then their luster dimmed somewhat. I also think the vocal kind of histrionic criticism of Putin from Prigozhin has hurt the Wagner Group's image because of the leadership, because it looks like they have a leader who many will say is colorful, theatrical, dramatic, and psychopathic. And being out in the open for that kind of a group, that kind of a leader, is probably not a good thing. They're more effective when they're kind of quiet in terms of how they do their work throughout Africa, in Syria. But they've taken hits in Syria. They lost several hundred fighters in a battle in 2018 with the U.S. Special Forces and the Kurdish forces. So
they've already had some. So in the real world, warfighter already understands their limitations far better than their kind of public image would.
I think their public image will continue to take a further hit, and that's where the leadership, like Putin, President Putin, will have to decide: have they become more of a liability in terms of the narrative that he wants to try to spin about the war, and especially if he, at some point in the future, can create a narrative that he achieved his objectives, that Russia stood up against NATO and is now ready to negotiate. I don't think either side is ready to negotiate, but I think at some point they will get there.
And also, I think this is very interesting. There were a few articles, I think the New York Times, a Post, a few others, that went when it kind of did a deep dive that further took the sheen off the Wagner Group, that they were basically trotting around to prisons in Siberia saying, you got 20 more years here, sign up with us. If you live, you're free. Right? I think that's not the image of an elite special operations group that only picks the best of the best. If you're trolling through Siberia's prisons, asking men who are, desperate to get out of frozen conditions for 20 decades by risking death on the front lines in Ukraine, that also, like, it diminishes sort of their aura.
Yeah, it diminishes. I think it seriously diminished their aura. If people have compared, Wagner traditionally recruited from Spetsnaz, from Russian special forces, similar to what companies like 15 years ago, 20 years ago, Blackwater, Triple Canopy would recruit from the U.S. Marines and the special forces community. Recruiting prisoners, desperate prisoners, is definitely a huge step down. And I think if the leadership of Russia, President Putin, wants to use Wagner as a type of asymmetric threat, part of a larger form of hybrid warfare that they had done successfully for many years in the cyber front and the military front, then they need to reorganize it and they need new leadership. And I think we need to be wary if they put in people of the caliber of Victor Bout to be the CEO, because someone like that would professionalize it in a hurry.
Very capable man.
A very capable adversary.
I don't know. We needed to give him up for a stoned basketball player, quite frankly, but decisions that no one asked me about. But sort of in that same vein, since all this began, to the extent that you had a fixed opinion of President Putin, has it changed as a result of what you've seen the last year, or is it, or not? Is it kind of static?
No, when we talked the last time, I mentioned Putin really, along with Xi and Kim, who I've studied, Kim Jong-un, the Chairman Kim of North Korea, kind of what I call the 3 R's. They're rational, they're ruthless, and they're very resilient. So that really hasn't changed. In Putin's case, I would add rigid, because I think he's had a narrowing over the last 5 to 10 years of his inner circle, of the higher quality of people that he could draw on in the first decade or so, the first 2 terms from 2000 to 2008, and while he was prime minister from 2008 to 2012, he could draw on a wider range of really sophisticated talent. I think that inner circle's become much more hardline, much more narrow, and that's part of it is why the intelligence failure occurred, because it was all very stovepiped, and they were basically, in all likelihood, telling President Putin what he wanted to hear. And I think that's probably still continuing, except now it's breaking through because he can watch on Telegram and see Prigozhin criticizing him or other people. And there are critics on both sides in Russia domestically on Telegram. Some say they should fight the war much more aggressively, even to the point of using tactical nuclear weapons. And others are saying this war is horrible and we should figure out a way to cut our losses. There's been more of that leaking out. So I think it's it's more complicated, but I think his rigidity, which I've talked about with you the last time, that a lot of leaders as they get older, especially autocratic leaders, can be prone to kind of dangerous groupthink and cognitive kind of rigidity where they see everything as black and white and don't see the nuances, higher order effects, or think in gray. And I think that's become a real challenge for President Putin.
Probably makes sense. Did we freeze? Oops, Ken, you still there? Uh-oh. Hello? Hello? Huh. Huh. Right. So that comment you're making, we had a little bit of a glitch there, that autocratic leaders like Putin tend to get a little more rigid in their thinking as they grow older. Arguably, we all do. But
Yes.
is it also kind of that natural effect of it's very hard, especially for an autocrat, to take criticism from someone junior. So just by nature of getting older and having people that were your contemporaries that maybe you would have listened to, literally dying off, that the pool of people who will, give clear negative feedback to the great leader are just diminishing. Is that kind of part of the dynamic?
Yeah, I think that's part of the dynamic, and we see it even in democratic societies such as ours, where there have been glaring in the history, glaring at times intelligence failures, because it's very easy to get a lot of groupthink, and that's why I think the leadership psychology can be helpful in trying to tease that apart. It's more art than science. It's not as quantitative as the type of work that the financial community might do to try and predict outcomes. It's fuzzy. It's fuzzy data. It's soft data. But for all the quantitative data we have in the financial community, as you well know and have spoken on your podcast, nobody predicted the 2008 crash. So quantitative data is really good to have, but in terms of predictive power, it's tricky as well. There's been a real interesting research done at Wharton Business School. I'm drawing a blank on his name, the Good Judgment Project. He's a psychologist who did the Good Judgment Project. And what he found out in terms of predictions, they would feed predictions to amateur experts on all sorts of things like financial and economic things down the road. And they'd ask them a simple question. Do you think the stock market will go below 30,000 by December 31st, 2023? Or do you think Kim Jong-un will test a nuclear weapon in the next 90 days? Or do you think, and then they go back after and look at who got it right and who didn't, and look and do the quants and the percentages. And what they found is that there were intelligent, it's Philip Tetlock, that's who it is, the Good Judgment Project, Dr. Philip Tetlock. What they found was that really bright amateurs outperformed experts.
Right.
Which is pretty amazing. So the other type of thinking that can help us understand this is, of course, Daniel Kahneman's very famous paradigm of thinking fast and thinking slow.
Great book. Everybody should read to get a sense of how you make your own judgments. If you look at Kahneman's work, you'll never look at the way you make decisions the same way again.
So I've found it useful to sort of step out of my traditional just mere. It's not about psychiatry and mental illness, but sort of looking at a more global picture of how people think and trying to empathize and understand, put myself in the shoes of the adversary, the leader, and understand their their way of how they see the world and how others around them see the world. If you take Xi Jinping, for example, President Xi of China, there's a huge debate between really incredible experts, people of the likes of former foreign minister and now Australian ambassador to the U.S. Kevin Rudd, who wrote a terrific book, The Avoidable War, about China. There's a lot of debate on is President Xi a pure ideologue, and is that the only thing driving his decision making, or is he a pragmatist? And as I've suggested in some of my writings, can he meld those two ways of looking at the world together? Can he be partially not a disruptor, but a responsible stakeholder in the new kind of multipolar world that we've evolved into in the 21st century? My answer would be yes, based on what we've seen of his performance as a leader since 2012. But there are others who would say he's a pure ideologue, he's a pure creature of the party, and every decision he makes is driven by pure ideology. I don't think so, because on top of the ideology is this nationalist aspiration and dream of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese people, and the desire to make China a world-class superpower by 2049, the centenary of the revolution. So I think looking at leaders' visions and where they're going is very, very helpful in this regard, not only in terms of these leaders of superpowers, but leaders in, for example, in emerging markets in places like Africa, Southeast Asia. If you look at leaders that have had success in the past, like the late, great Lee Kuan Yew, or you look at the leaders who founded Israel, David Ben-Gurion, or you look at Paul Kagame in Rwanda, who has taken a nation from the trauma of genocide and built a fairly successful small society that's economically stable and has had high growth and has created jobs for a country where you could not have predicted that when he first took.
Miraculous transformation. For people who haven't looked at that carefully, they should, because it is kind of defied all the odds and logic. Vicious, fast genocide followed by an abrupt turnaround. It's kind of amazing what he did.
And part of what's interesting about Kagame as a leader, and I think this is something that investors will have to look at, is what is the leader's vision? Where are they going? Let me give an example of something he did that just is really dramatic and is going to change lives, not only in his country has changed, but in Africa and other places. There was a Bay Area startup called Zipline about 12, 13 years ago, and they went to Africa and went to Kagame with an idea that they would build drones that would carry medical products to villages. And Kagame said, sounds great, because he wanted to push the tech industry and create jobs around a nascent tech industry. And there's a lot of young people, a lot of human capital that can tap into that. So they set up shop in Kigali and built these little drones that are the size of a small box from Amazon, 3-4 pound max. And they're run remotely out of Kigali, and they were transporting blood products to villages in the Ruwenzori Mountains, the mountains of the moon where the famous gorillas live. And they, within a year or two of operationalizing these drones, Zipline, working with the Ministry of Health and creating jobs for Rwandans who would they trained them to man the drones and fly them, cut the postpartum maternal hemorrhage rate in Rwandan villages where there's no healthcare to zero. And they're doing this in Ghana now, working out of Accra. So there's a lot of, I think, really, really good leaders in emerging economies, in that do what really good leaders do anywhere. They really they combine a vision with a way to tap into the human capital. And this is where I think we get overly focused on our major adversaries, China, Russia, North Korea, and that's appropriate. We should be, but we should look at emerging nations and leaders and look at those who are doing it right, and and learn from them and partner with them, because the old models of development have failed. The idea that traditional development of writing a check and doing that hasn't really
Oh,
worked well.
don't even get me started. That's been proven to be worthless for decades. It's just an absolute nightmare. Uh, Horrible. A whole nother show
And
dealt with
if you look at
that.
venture capitalists and investors that are working in emerging markets and have written about this, um, Gabriel Schultz of Cerberus, or Jonathan Berman, who wrote a book about success in Africa, and other people like this that have sort of written about this and are very vocal and positive about it. Those investors are saying, when we partner with the right leaders with the right vision in places like Africa, Southeast Asia, and that, we can do dramatic things.
Oh,
And
it's awesome. There are 3 countries in Africa right now where I'm advising entrepreneurs and investors. We're doing kind of projects similar, some bigger scale, a couple smaller scale, but that's that the one thread of commonality running through it is they've got finally a stabilized government that is not busy stealing from everyone that walks in the door, and the leader actually has a vision of what it's going to be, whether it's we're cutting long-term foreign denominated debt, or whatever the main metrics they've chosen. It's usually 2 or 3 very solid, achievable, transparent goals that everybody can measure alongside them, and that transparency and that kind of goal-oriented process gives a huge amount of comfort, not just to foreign investors, but to domestic entrepreneurs and workers, that things actually are different. Like, I can actually expect that if I go to work, I no longer wonder whether I'm going to get paid in 2 weeks, right? Basic stuff that we take for granted in a rule of law society. For years, that great uncertainty just creates friction in the gears. And you're absolutely right. Those people with that vision, that leadership, are dramatically changing those nations.
and the other key variable, I think, in terms of leadership, is how leaders welcome people from many cultures, diverse cultures, immigrants. And this is where the example of Singapore and Israel is dramatic. And what these 2 tiny little nation states have been able to do, they're basically countries built on the backs of immigrants. And we used to do this pretty well too. We need to get back to that model, because it's what makes America the greatest country in the world. And we need to play to our strengths. President Xi is playing to his strengths in China, but the Chinese dream only works for you if you're Han Chinese.
Right.
And Dr. Jiwook Shin, who heads the APARC Research Center at Stanford, a conglomerate of research programs on China, Japan, Korea, and Southeast Asia, has written brilliantly about this, which is the problem that Japan has had, that South Korea has, that China has, that they don't have a way to increase their pool of human capital in these aging societies, because they don't welcome immigrants and outsiders in the same way that other nations do. And I think the other thing that will be key in places like Africa is it's going to be generational. Many of the leaders like Kagame, Museveni, and others are not young. And so what will the next generation do? Many of whom are trained in the West in business models and technology, and will bring these skill sets back to countries like South Africa, like Nigeria, the big countries, Kenya, Senegal, Uganda, Ethiopia. I think that will really be a driver in the next 10, 20, 30 years, because of the human capital potential there. So I think that's a real key thing that leaders do, is they tap into human capital, not in a psychological way as has been written traditionally in leadership analysis, where they have a lock-key fit with their followers.
Right.
I don't think this is helpful.
It's
I think
more
they
pragmatic.
it's governance outcomes, and they create opportunity for people, and that means more to people than anything. Freedom of opportunity to build a future for themselves and their family. That's going to be the key thing, the key metric.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think most And just because of the nature of the society that we live in, I think most Americans who don't spend a lot of time abroad, or who don't live abroad and spend time in very different cultures, it's the nuance you miss. A good friend of mine I went to business school with, born in Beijing, native Han Chinese, right? His parents were very much adversely affected by the Cultural Revolution, but he said, ironically, Mao and his minions were wrong about so many things. They sent the family out to a May 4th farm so these uppity professors could learn how to be a peasant. Well, the good news is people in the city starved and the people on farms lived. So he survived because he was raised on a farm with his professor parents who were being taught to value the peasantry. Anyway, what I found was fascinating was he and his family they've got a child, and they moved to an English speaking country for a number of years. And when they went back, he and I were just having a casual conversation. And I mentioned something about how is your now 9 or 10-year-old son reintegrating back into the Chinese school system. He said, "Oh no, he's a foreigner now. He will never be treated as an equal member of Chinese society because he spent 4 years speaking English, which in America would be a great skill. Right now, you're bilingual. How wonderful is that? But in that society, would he be ostracized? No. But would they ever treat him as someone that would be on a fast track to a CEO role? So when he went back to China, where he was born and where he was raised and where his native language is Mandarin, he went into the English speaking school to finish high school and then go to American college. That is one of the most kind of telling vignettes to me about the difference between a welcoming, inclusive society and a walled off, exclusive society. And I don't know if that's something that can be changed, or if they even want to change it. Right? I don't know.
One of the Lyndon Johnson's presidency was a tragic one because of the Vietnam War, but the Immigration Act that allowed generations of immigrants from all over the world to come here, a lot of those people became the drivers of the tech boom. If you look at the tech companies in Silicon Valley and other places. So the United States has often done this right. And I've argued the new Cold War that people talk about is a Cold War on many fronts. One of them is human capital. We should find a way to engage more with China, with Russia, when the horrible war ends with Ukraine, and there are 300,000 Chinese students studying in the U.S. and about similar amount of Indian students. We should welcome them here and turn them into Americans.
Oh, of course.
There are a lot of Africans studying here. We should be welcoming Africans, Middle Easterners, because there's that native energy and human capital that once they tap into it and we create the foundations for them to people. You've lived all over the world. I've lived and traveled all over the world. People, when you get to them on a human level, all want the same thing. They want a better life for themselves and their children.
That's it.
So I think we can tap into that in ways that our adversaries can't. And there is a grain of, I don't mean this to sound arrogant, but I believe in that piece of American exceptionalism. I truly believe in that this is a unique place for that ethos is unique. It's part of our social fabric, and we need to strengthen it and make our country more welcoming, because there's a lot of migration flows, as Parag Khanna has written about in his book Move. You got 10 million refugees from the Ukraine war. Russia's had a tragic brain drain of a whole generation of young, talented people from the age of 20 to 50. Created by President Putin's war. They likely won't go back.
No.
If President Xi cracks down harder in terms of the social controls and the party controls in China, he may drive away the entrepreneurs who have driven the growth of the last 40 years that has lifted 500, 600 million people out of poverty, one of the greatest historic achievements ever. So I think it's really important for leaders to look at that broader picture of what kind of a society they want people to aspire to, In a sense, they have to be visionary and aspirational. And I think when private sector investors are looking at smaller countries, or even China for that matter, on how to invest, the question they all ask is the same: is this person someone I can do business with? Is
Right.
this someone I can collaborate with? Is this someone that we can work together and grow and negotiate with and achieve our business goals? So I think that's an important thing for business people to also look at, not just national security people in times of war crises, but in other types of complex negotiations.
Very well put. Right. It would be as a mental exercise, I've always found Xi's actions to be fascinating. Right. I mean, to my mind, you have inherited the reins of a booming economy that you've kind of, the people right before you and the policies have created almost the magic sauce, right? You've got fairly kind of stable societal relations. You don't have a huge amount of criminality. You've got a burgeoning middle class and entrepreneurial class galloping along with huge growth rates. And to someone like my way of thinking, like, great, like, don't mess with what's not broken, right? So you could get in charge and ride that wave, like continue doing what was there. That knee-jerk reaction to, in my mind, of course, I don't know the man and I don't speak Mandarin and I don't live in his shoes, but that idea of I'm going to kind of go backwards and create a more repressive state than existed before. Maybe other people understand that logic. To me, that's just one of the most baffling things I've ever seen in world history. Like, you inherited something booming, and arguably, if you'd like just taken up watercolor painting and checked in once an afternoon, the country still would have galloped along beautifully. You would have taken credit for it, but he didn't do that. And I'm kind of fascinated as to why.
I think that's the part the part of Xi that is a party man, truly a creature of the CCP, and the need for control. I think he's had a great many successes, and he's probably the most powerful leader in the world today. But the problem is the type of things that he was able to solve, in the sense, as I've written and spoken, he's playing Go while we're struggling to play checkers. But in a way that's easier, it's easier to sort of think from a Go concept of building barriers, military islands in the South China Sea. That's pretty easy compared to the challenges that President Xi faces. Or, okay, he has a restive population in Tibet and Xinjiang. He can figure out social controls for them and the Hong Kongers. But how does he deal with an aging population?
Bigger problem.
How does he deal with the middle income trap? How does he shift an export-driven economy to a domestic consumption economy if he cuts off further from the West, or puts in more bureaucratic barriers to Western companies going in there, and quote, who are now de-risking and sort of looking for more fertile ground for their overseas investments? That's a harder problem. In a sense, his third term, he has much harder problems to deal with than he did the first two. And I'm not sure, based on his past performance, one would argue that he will probably have some modicum of success if he shows flexibility and pragmatism. But those problems are so hard that he could do everything right and still fail. As
Oh,
could any other,
absolutely. Completely,
because they're
absolutely.
so incredibly hard. And I think that's a scale issue. And Modi has this, Prime Minister Modi has the same challenges with India. How to allow investment in, how to sort of deal with the human capital that he has, and shift, a couple hundred more people out of poverty. I think one of the drivers of this that's really fascinating is technology. And you think of smartphones, and you and I have talked about this in my field, in the health field. I'm amazed at what Africa's done with smartphones, that they've built digital highways with 70% smartphone penetration.
Right.
That's equivalent to what we have in the United States. 30% of the people in the US have no internet. And especially when you get in rural areas, that number is higher. But even in urban areas, I live in Dallas County, 2.7 million people live in Dallas County. 30% of people in Dallas County have no internet.
That's
About
incredible.
35 to 40% of people in Texas have no internet. But a lot of people have a smartphone that may not have a laptop and internet landlines. Well, Africa has no landlines, but
Right.
they have
To skip that.
70%
Most
smartphone
brilliant way
penetration.
to skip all that capital expenditure ever.
So that they leapfrogged all that expenditure and created these digital highways where farmers can trade crop prices, people can do their own mobile banking in China as well, and in India and other countries in South Asia. The area where the United States should be a world leader and sadly is not is global telemedicine. And in my field of medicine, where anyone who has a smartphone can get healthcare. You build a digital highway and you have different lanes. You have the financial lane, you have the commodities lane, the markets lane, you have the social media lane, and you have a healthcare lane and other lanes. So that's an area where America can lead and should lead, but a lot of people aren't looking at it that way and don't understand how these countries work, how a farmer in Africa can call in their crop prices and decide whether to send their crop from a village in northern Ghana to Accra by looking at their smartphone. So I think when it comes to healthcare, the same sort of magic is possible, and I think we'll see that. I just hope America will be in the lead, because other countries like India and China and African countries are experimenting with these types of platforms, because they basically can bring healthcare to anyone in their country that has a smartphone. That's really remarkable. And the pandemic accelerated that process and taught us that we can do that, and blew up our prior model of thinking, which was, unless you're sitting in my office, I can't take care of you.
Right.
So that's, I think there are going to be other drivers of, and health is a huge, if you look at environmental social governance metrics, what they call ESG, health is a huge driver of that. And the really brilliant leaders of the next generation in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, in our country, will understand that who drives that kind of decision making? Women.
Right.
Women.
Yep.
Most healthcare decisions for children in the family, their own, their spouse, are driven. The drivers of that are women. So if you put a smartphone in every woman's hands in the world with healthcare platforms, you're doing a good thing. And there are companies that you and I know, and you've worked with, and I've spoken with, venture capital companies that are looking to do this in places like Africa, but are stymied. American companies, but they're stymied by regulatory barriers.
Oh, the regulatory
old
smothering.
thinking, what I call old thinking.
Old thinking, the regulatory smothering of American healthcare is one of the dumbest business model decisions that a political class and a lobbying class have ever forced upon us, and it's absolutely terrifying. You work in the field. For my sins, I'm a policy wonk, so I spend time like just all of these entire buildings full of bureaucrats standing between your doctor giving you a pill that is just, it's appalling. Like, it is appalling. It is so completely appalling that the one thing that has ever been shown to increase quality of service and product and decrease price is free competition. It's the only thing. Only thing. Millions of people making free decisions create better outcomes. And the bureaucratic mindset loathes that. That combined with liability insurance companies that are worried about getting sued by the billboard sleaze bags that I pass on I-95 every day. It's terrifying. There is better healthcare in plenty of other countries that have freer systems without shackles that
let
we
me share a story with your listeners, which is what you've argued is when you live overseas and use healthcare overseas, as you've done and as I have, the scales fall off your eyes, because most in my field, for example, antidepressants in the United States, to get an antidepressant, you must go see a physician, someone like a nurse practitioner or a PA or a primary care doctor or a psychiatrist. We're very expensive.
Right.
A psychiatrist is very expensive. We're going to bill 500, 600 an hour to the insurance company. That's a lot of money. And then they will prescribe a generic for you. But in most countries in the world, generic antidepressants are over the counter. So if you give patients the tools and technology and AI algorithms in terms of clinical decision making, simple stuff for the patient, apps, and they can buy generic medicine, at least as a first step in their care, then they can do that. There's a lot of, we're now, Narcan for overdoses, for opiates has now gone generic, as it should be.
Right.
That means everyone who has an addict in their family can buy a bunch of those. So if they come home and find that person, passed
Right in
out,
the nose.
with it, save a life.
Yep.
Just like the police do when they carry Narcan.
Yep.
So there's a lot of that kind of thinking. And my scales fell off my eyes when I was based in India. I was talking to a person at the embassy at the water cooler, if you will, and they said, "I want to tell you a story." I said, "Sure." And they said, "I've been very stressed out. I've been depressed. I got to this country. I've had a lot of culture shock. I can't sleep. I'm crying every day. I don't feel like getting out of bed. I'm tired. I can't concentrate on my job, and I feel very hopeless." I said, "It sounds
no
like
more curry. No more curry."
Yeah, no more curry. I said, "Let me give you a card, make an appointment." And the person said, "Actually, I don't need you." Now, most physicians, when someone tells them, "I don't need you," recoil and they get defensive. Fortunately, I shut my mouth and said, "Please explain." And the patient, this was 20 years ago when the internet and that was still newer and smartphones were all in their infancy. And she said, "Well, I Googled I looked up my symptoms online and I realized what I had, and I looked online for the treatment, and I went down to the corner little pharmacy run by some little Sikh guy in a turban, and I said, I need some sertraline, Zoloft." And he said, "Yes, ma'am." And for $2, she got a month's worth and took it and felt better. Right. I said, "Then you don't need me. You're correct." Right. But my whole paradigm of medical care got blown up by that. And I think there are a lot of conditions where we can trust the patients with the technology we have, not only in our country, but in developing countries, to expand what we can do with healthcare. And I think that's terribly exciting, but it's kind of anathema to traditional medical professionals. But I dream of a day when every patient of mine will have a 5 or 6G smartphone, and I can see a patient anywhere in the world that they are. I have patients who travel who ask, "Why can't I see you when I'm in Europe? Because our lawyers won't let you." Or, "Why can't I see you when I go visit my relatives in Africa for the summer?" Or when my kid goes to college overseas for a semester. So I think those changes are going to come because the technology developers, investors such as yourself, private sector, venture capital, private equity are going to drive that train, and our consumers, our patients are. So I think that's exciting, and I think visionary leaders of those countries already see that. You had a guest on your show, a good friend of mine, a mutual friend of ours, Jim Hawes,
yes,
who's working on a project like this, a telecom project, basically building a digital highway in a West African country, where you would provide all of these services on the digital highway, and think of apps as like rest stops on the highway, and people can tap into what they need. So I think that's terribly exciting, and I think that's the kind of leadership questions that I'm studying and trying to understand more, besides just the otherwise very important national security leadership questions, looking at people like the supreme leader of Iran, or Chairman Kim Jong-un, or President Xi, or President Putin. I think that's very important, but we have to sort of step away from that and look at what's visionary in terms of where we're going in the next couple decades.
Yeah, I would actually add something that you probably have thought about. That there were two things that I've discerned from watching this war, and also studying very closely our own Revolutionary War. And these are all intertwined. So I sit on the board of directors of the Combat Control Foundation now. So we're very even more attuned to this rather specific needs of the special operations community, which I think um, most Americans, to the extent the 93% of Americans that don't serve in the military, to the extent they give any thought to it at all, would kind of lump it all together, right? But even for the small percentage of soldiers in uniform that are the warfighter, that are the point of the spear, that are incurring personal danger, that's a smaller percentage of the overall armed force to begin with. Um, but there's also something very different about being an infantryman or a tank commander or anyone where you are potentially hitting a button and shooting something 800 yards away. That's very different than what most special operations troops are asked to do. It's very up close and personal, and there, as you well know, there's for all the money poured into psychological studies and judging, trying to prejudge and guess or predict which person or which of those soldiers will incur very extreme post-traumatic stress versus some who apparently seem able to shrug it off. Um, and there's almost no predictability in that, which I find kind of fascinating. But I also think that most people don't really ever get an understanding of what we ask these men to do. And frankly, what do you know at 19 when you sign up for this, right? You're gung ho, you're an American, you're a phenomenal athlete, you're driven, you're all those things that make you the 12% that survive combat control training, or make you the 14% that survive SEALs training, right? But that doesn't mean that you are any fundamentally different as a human being at 22 years old than anyone else is. And so when you encounter horrors that you are either have caused or are part of, a lot of that falls apart. The reason I'm saying that is it coincides with a brilliant model of kind of telemedicine and psychiatric assistance that is now being provided to members of the special operations community, both active and veteran. But the active community, they've got very specific concerns, right? If you put yourself forward and say, I'm stressed out, I'm depressed, I'm whatever, and your commanding officer hears about that, you may get passed over for the next time a team is assembled to go down range, right? So you signed up for this. This is your career. You want to be in the action. But if you you got these conflicting signals from the institution that if you ask for help, that asking for help, which is what we want them to do, could actually disqualify you from advancing in your career. I think that was one kind of fascinating point. The other point I found very fascinating related to leadership and efficacy of arms is the Russian army does not have a non-commissioned officer class, right? Every colonel, every full bird colonel and one-star general that is leading troops, they've got a master sergeant that gives them ground truth, right? That is part of that relationship. You are never to lie to me. You are never to tell me what you think I want to hear. You are here to tell me hard shit like I'm doing this wrong. I think that those combinations together institutionally show why the American military is so incredibly effective and why the Russian military, despite its numbers and the rest of it, has proven to bog down. They have no sergeants, they have no corporals. They're privates and officers. What do you think of that? Am I being too
I
simplistic?
want to comment about what you said about mental health in the special forces community and the stigma. And when I was overseas, I've counseled and treated military members, including members of the special forces. I've certainly treated and counseled members of the intelligence community and the diplomatic community, law enforcement like FBI, DEA, Homeland Security, marshals overseas. They all are part of the embassy health program. I think the stigma is there. I think it's better. Good leaders try to preempt and try to encourage people to seek help when problems are smaller and more manageable, if you will, than waiting till the shoe drops when they're in crisis.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it. They're getting better. There's certainly more awareness of suicide, even among our elite special forces. And there's more understanding of respite, the importance of respite in health, of taking care of yourself, of self-care, what they call wellness, respite, i.e. breaks, where during the war against terror, we we saw many people in the special forces community deploying over and over and over to do the most demanding missions. And I think the other thing, people I've worked with who worked with that community a lot, such as Andy Walsh, Dr. Andy Walsh, and Dr. Eric Potterat, who was the chief psychologist of the Navy SEALs before he retired. He's now a sports psychologist, the chief sports psychologist for the LA Dodgers. These are people who work with elite teams and try to get the best out of them, if you will. And what they found is it's really hard. There's a lot of research in the area of who will develop PTSD and who won't. You look at things like neuropeptide Y, but there's variables that we don't understand very well in terms of hardiness, grit, resilience, who has it, who doesn't. It's still kind of unpredictable. I had lunch when I was a resident in psychiatry over 30 something years ago with the chief psychologists of the Israeli army who had been in the Sayeret Matkal, their special forces. And I asked him about selection. And a lot has been written about selection. How do you pick the person who's going to become the combat controller or the Green Beret or the Navy SEAL? And he said it's real hard to measure. He said, I serve with guys, and I've talked to American Special Forces officers and soldiers who said, college athletes, top athletes flunk out of this selection. And the Israeli guy told me the same thing. There were people who finished last on every training evolution, whining, complaining, finished last. But in combat, they never quit.
Right.
So he fought with some in the Lebanon War in 1982. So how do you measure those human qualities of grit, of endurance? And also what Dr. Potterat and Dr. Walsh have looked at is looking at creativity and the ability to tap into other emotions. With the elite athletes they work with at Red Bull International, they've brought in improv coaches to teach them how to cry on command.
That's awesome.
And many of these elite athletes, these are people who surf 90-foot, 80-foot waves in Australia, or bungee jump 10,000 feet or ski down the Grand Teton. And they said, being told to cry on command by my improv coach was the hardest thing I've ever done.
Hardest thing I ever had to do. Right.
So there's what Andy Walsh and Eric Potterat were tapping into here is trying to understand different qualities of how to motivate and lead people, which is getting in touch with their emotions. And to do that, good leaders need to be in touch with their own emotions as well. Yeah. So there's a lot of literature on this in the military world, in the special forces world, in medicine, in the business world, and in government. A greater appreciation.
That was the point. I'm sorry, I got so lost in my tangled tale that I forgot the point I was trying to make. You were talking about telemedicine and improved business models as it pertained to that particular issue of I'm active duty SEALs, combat control, range, or whatever, and I need help. Someone has created this system, and he did this sadly because his brother, who was a combat controller, committed suicide. He created this platform, which finally solved that problem in the sense of they bring in qualified psychologists and psychiatrists on one side of the platform, and it's paid for by foundations like us or by individuals or people donate their time. And the person looking for help, it is not even an email which will identify you. You log into the app, it gives you a number, and you are known by that number. So you can get help. No one needs to know about it. And it was one of those, it was a great example of a tech and business solution. How do I solve for this? How does the person who needs the help know that the person they're talking to is actually qualified, right? Is a real physician or a psychologist, but also provided that anonymity. And that
you provide the platform. You provide the platform where they can log in a safe way.
And we are evaluating that right now. We're as we make a greater investment, we're asking for statistics around efficacy and all the rest of it. But I love the solution, right? As this guy who created it said, I don't know if this would have saved my brother, but I do know that we lost him and it was horrible. And if we can prevent that happening to anybody else, because he was a tough guy, right? He was a tough guy. He was a combat controller, right? He was hard, driven, tough guy. That's what he was. And him asking for help was clearly turned out to be impossible. And so I thought that was a great application of something that solved a multidimensional problem, at least partially, by not stigmatizing you're looking for help, which would then potentially derail your career. I love that.
Yeah, I've spent a large part of my career, and I'm still now working on a project with law enforcement in the community, as a volunteer with Tony Brinker's One Community USA group, and that's the hard part, is you're working with people like diplomats or intelligence officers, military, special forces, law enforcement. These are not people that naturally come to a mental health professional. But if you use technology to build in peer support, which leads then to the specialists when they need them, and apps, initially an app to sort of check, do I fall in this category? I need to talk to a peer. It's a gradient. Then the peer says they're trained, and they say, you can be part of this group on the app that can provide peer support. But if you need more, then they go further down the gradient to you need to talk to a mental health professional. You often will have people who've done that in order to reduce the stigma barrier.
Right.
You have to make yourself more, people from my end have to be available. And one of the beautiful things about virtual care, I do about 70% of my work with virtual care.
Wow.
And
That's a high percentage. That's interesting.
and it's intimate. When the patient logs into the virtual platform, they're allowing me the privilege of coming into their own home.
Mm.
And that's really important because it takes us back to the basics of caring for people. And the technology has made this possible. People talk a lot about bridging racial divides in healthcare, which exists sadly, or socioeconomic divides. But this little tool bridges those divides. They've done studies over the last couple of years that over 3/4 of people in rural America like telemedicine on a smartphone. 82% of women like it. About 3/4 of Hispanics like it, including many of my patients who are probably not legally here. Every time they drive to the doctor office, they're putting themselves at risk if they get in a wreck or get pulled over of being deported. Talking on a smartphone eliminates that hazard for them. I have patients who are African American single parents who I treat for postpartum depression, and they have a kid. They don't have a car. They don't have the support
Logistics
system.
are a barrier.
But if they have a phone, I saw a young woman with severe postpartum depression last month I saw her face, and she's breastfeeding her baby and able to talk to me about getting a care and a follow-up visit to optimize her care so we can get her better. So the things we can do with these technologies, I think patients are teaching us that these are life-saving technologies and can bridge a lot of barriers in terms of the digital barriers, the socioeconomic, and the racial barriers. That's what I call doing DEI. I don't talk about DEI. I do DEI every day.
Excellent. That's huge. Well, Ken, I can talk forever, and I appreciate your time. Is there any sort of big overarching thing that people are more interested in getting a grip on, some of the major headaches and issues we're facing? You point them towards good authors.
Yes, I think like you and I have talked about on a previous episode, those that are interested in national security issues, I certainly would refer them to the Cipher Brief, to its webinars, its daily podcasts with the CEO Susan Kelly and the CEO with Brad, and I think they do a terrific job in creating a brilliant Brad Christian, a brilliant platform for national security, as well as some of the technological challenges working with the private sector, AI, how it affects us. It's just a brilliant platform. I love it, and I read it it's the first thing I read with my coffee every day, so I want to put in a plug for it.
Good plug for the Cipher Brief, and certainly Suzanne and Brad have done a phenomenal job. I was privileged to have met Brad just as he was transitioning out of the military, and then he'd been in private security for a few years. So he had a transition from military to quasi-military, and then we're actually having lunch with him in Virginia when he took the job at Cipher Brief. So it's been great to watch his move towards being in sort of running a journalistic platform. It's been brilliant. Brilliant.
If I think of leaders in America, Suzanne's in my top 100 list. You know, what she's done is just amazing and really a transformational kind of leader. I have nothing but admiration for her and Brad.
No doubt. So we plug the Cipher Brief. We'll put the link down below.
Okay, thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for having me.
Talk soon. Cheers. Have a good one.
Okay.
Learn what Bitcoin is, how it works, and why it matters. Bitcoin 101, your ultimate guide to the fundamentals of blockchain.